Arthur C. Clarke, the author of 2001, A Space Odyssey, has a theory. The human eye is a camera, he says. It forms an image of the outer world on its sensitive screen, the retina, then transmits it to the brain. Could this system sometimes work in reverse, so that the brain sends images to the eye, making it not a camera, but a TV screen? Then believing would be seeing.
Ordinary perception is a construction of partially what is actually out there and lots of what is inside you.
Dean Radin.
It looks more like a discussion with the rest of reality and agreeing upon something that ought to occur at the end, which is a magical idea. And that's why we're kind of uncomfortable with it from the Western scientific point of view, because we don't know what to do with that.
Pedestrian lines like "beauty is in the eye of the beholder" come to mind. How about the devil? In the eye of the beholder too? What about ghosts and goblins? Michael Persinger.
15 years ago, we were basically evaluating transcendental meditation, and we had an experienced teacher in the laboratory. And we were doing a routine EEG, about 15, 16 minutes into the session. And then she began to throw spikes and slow wave. It was evident, at first I thought it was an equipment error, but I looked and it was spikes and slow wave activity, clearly epileptic, emerging from the temporal lobes, primarily the right side. At the end of the experience, she concluded that God had been with her, the cosmic consciousness had been with her in the laboratory, and that she'd had a profound religious experience. I didn't tell her that at that time, when she was having the experience, she was displaying electrical epileptic activity over the temporal lobe. The experience was so profound to me that I began to pursue the idea that perhaps God experiences and mystical experiences were clearly tied to transient electrical activity involving the temporal lobe.
This is Ideas. You're listening to Haunted House, Haunted Mind by Don Hill.
I didn't set out looking for God, and I certainly didn't expect the presence of the Lord could make one feel so bloody awful, if that's what visited upon my former mountain abode. Maybe it was just my cultural conditioning, my imagination imposing a negative spin on an otherwise benign temporal lobe seizure, stimulated by EMF in the local geology underfoot beneath the house. Perhaps it could have been a wonderful, pleasant experience if only I had thought about it differently. Maybe I was just crazy with paranoia or something. Or maybe not. Paul Devereaux.
Now, if we are looking at these places, and if there are geophysical fields of various sorts, it may not be a direct hallucination, but auditory hallucinations are often triggered in these places.
Diary. My uncle, the crazy one, he heard voices. And one day, a day that proved his undoing, he turned over the cash register in the local general store, shouting on about money changers in a backwoods town in northern Ontario. He was incarcerated, an asylum for the insane, never to come out again, until he was buried alongside his mother and father, my grandma and grandfather. I recognized myself in his pictures. The same gaze, the same penetrating look, looking for what's out there. So what about my house? Perhaps there's a scientific basis to account for stony Indian lore about spirits throughout the Bow Valley, some beneficial, some bad, and how we, the living, should not remain in this locale unless we're seeking a spiritual vision. And what about all the contemporary reports of hauntings, including a recent visitation by a ghostly apparition dubbed Lisa at the Canmore Community Recreation Center, of all places? Might there be a certain something working in consort with EMF, something a Tibetan Lama might call bad karma, present in the landscape itself, that could induce these visions?
This presence can be terrible, wrathful, fearful, demonic, or godlike, angelic, or beatific in one form or another. But they can have positive and negative effects, but always powerful, and always the sense of being from the other world. And that's what people would recognize. So the places you did not go, unless you were a powerful shaman who deliberately dealt with the dark forces, if you like, or it'd be other places where perhaps you did go for your vision quest or whatever. There were more beneficent places, if you like. And of course, because of this interaction, we see in early cultures and traditional cultures a tremendous technology of consciousness, a tremendous understanding, a psychological mapping of these states that we're simply not used to.
Some points on the landscape emit higher levels of EMF than others. Caves, the tops of mountains, for instance, the very spots where mystics have traditionally sought extraordinary experience, the hiding place of the gods, and perhaps the devil too. Electromagnetic radiation generated by tectonic strain, particularly along earthquake zones, may well be fueling the troubled spots on our planet, territory which perpetually hosts war. The Balkan nations, for instance, are situated in a high-risk earthquake zone. Embedded within the landscape, unseen, unheard, but otherwise felt, might some obscure force make you crazy, perhaps violent, without ever openly tipping its hand? Does the miracle at Fatima make more sense considering the geophysical landscape underfoot? 20,000 people reported an extraordinary display of lights in the sky. The immediate area is rife with faults. As for my own ghostly encounter, the Bow Valley in the Canadian Rockies is home to 5 major geological faults converging on a focal point at Banff. I'm convinced I felt something awful. Certain I witnessed a presence. The perception was very realistic.
The interesting thing is that the brain, particularly the temporal lobe, and deep within the temporal lobe, the amygdala, and its primary function would predict that depending on how these environmental electromagnetic fields stimulated the brain, you could get very pleasant experiences or very fearful ones.
Michael Persinger.
It's going to be relatively easier from the point of view of the technology of the brain to stimulate fearfulness. And in general, the negative areas are likely to be more common than the pleasant ones. The reason being is that fearfulness and intense fear and terror are the consequences of the extreme stimulations of the brain. The milder stimulations, which are more difficult to get naturally, and those are the ones that produce the more pleasant ones, would be expected to be more infrequent, just in terms of statistical distribution.
Diary. In 1995-96, there were 22 known suicides in the Bow Valley. That's well over 5 times the national average. What could account for this discrepancy?
Because there's an area of the brain, the amygdala, which allows you to experience pleasure, euphoria, pleasantness, security, versus terror and fear, and because terror and fear is the experience associated with the greatest, most intense stimulation, it's more likely, because of the ungraded stimulation in the environment, that there'd be more fearful areas than pleasant ones. But there would be pleasant ones.
Diary, Vancouver. Annala McNeil, the Tibetan nun, told me about the energy she felt during a retreat on the island of Delos, Greece. By the 3rd day, she was hallucinating. The roofs were growing, slipping back. Rock holds energy, she said. If you stay anywhere, just stay in one spot, things will start to happen. Diary, Cypress Hills, Saskatchewan. Sharon Butala, the author of The Perfection in the Morning, showed me several hot spots on the family cattle ranch. My first impression was we were atop some kind of burial ground. She disagreed at the time with my feeling, but later told me in Vancouver that I was probably right. That was what a native woman had told her. Anyway, she showed me a small spot, a circle of stone, warned me not to step into it. She once did and got the overwhelming sensation that she had no business being there, that she must leave, get out. A feeling of presence. EMF? In a letter, I asked her to check it out with a compass, a primitive attempt to see if there was any magnetic energy to attract the point or make it spin awry. She wrote back, "No, sorry."